Hi again. Today I'm going to talk about Marked for Death, a book by James Hamilton Paterson. And you may remember I reviewed his previous book, Empire of the Skies, which was a superb look at British military or British aviation since the Second World War and the great Farnborough shows and things like that. Marked for Death goes back to military aviation in the First World War, and only 11 years after the Wright brothers' first flight, the World War started, which was basically a family dispute which absorbed millions of people. But at first, the generals didn't see any role for aircraft. They said they would never replace the horse, for example. But gradually, some people switched on to the idea. And the book quotes the military attitude at the time. A former chief of the Imperial General Staff said, "There have been many changes in the British Army, and I have opposed them all." So that's what they were up against, and in many ways that attitude prevails still to today, where anything new or revolutionary comes along. One of the things that the book covers is the role of what was then called the Royal Aircraft Factory, which we now know as the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough. And it was kind of the link between the government and industry. The aircraft industry at the time was obviously very, very small. Quite often it was just a garage industry with individual designers just virtually hand-making the aircraft. And unfortunately, they came up with some terrible designs between the Farnborough and private industry. But really the Germans didn't really do much better, so it was a pretty even keel. But there were some terrible designs which killed an awful lot of pilots. One design, and I've put a picture of it up, was the BE9, which because of the way the British aircraft were armed, which I'll talk about just now, positioned the gunner / observer in a kind of a wicker basket, which was no more than a deck chair, sitting at the front of the aircraft. Immediately behind him was the propeller, and so he was fully exposed at the front. Now, these aircraft, they didn't use runways. They used to land in fields, and they were very, very liable to tip over. And if you're sitting at the front of the aircraft, you could be killed or severely injured as a result of that, if nothing else. The book covers training, and I should put that word in inverted commas because a lot of the training was terrible. Cases of a guy never seen an aircraft before, never been in an aircraft before, young guy, his late teens, gets in with an experienced pilot. They go up to height, and the instructor then says, "You take over." And if he can't land the aircraft, he's considered a reject. That's without any explanation of how the controls worked or anything. And gradually this was improved. Initially, the syllabus didn't cover spin recovery. Spinning the aircraft, a loss of control, was regarded as kind of arcane territory, and there was no set procedure for recovering from a spin. Now, each aircraft has different spin characteristics, so it was difficult at first, particularly when they didn't know what caused the spin, but eventually people did understand the mechanics of spinning. And a Major Robert Smith Barry started a really revolutionary training syllabus, which was step by step explaining aeronautics, explaining the physics of flight, explaining how the engines worked, the parts of the aircraft, what the control surfaces did, and then flying, navigation, and so on. And he did this at Gosport initially, and it spread, and it became the Gosport system or the Gosport school. And his pupils started surviving. Most of the aircraft at this time were two-seaters. You had the pilot and the observer/gunner, because originally the aircraft were observation aircraft. They were to fly over the enemy positions and for reconnaissance reasons. And the gunner was eventually armed as the war progressed, but it was originally spotting for artillery or plotting enemy positions, so the observer. In the British system, the pilot was in command and the observer was the second man. The German system was the other way around. The observer was in command and the pilot was just the driver. And this was kind of based on the idea of, in a staff car, the boss sits in the back and the driver is just of a lower rank. But eventually the Germans changed to the British system. Big section on weapons. Now, at first, as I mentioned, they were observation aircraft. They were unarmed, but then they would wave to the enemy and so on. But then it got more hostile, and they would carry weapons in case they were forced down and had to defend themselves. But they started shooting at each other in the air, sometimes dropping grenades on enemy positions, firing pistols at each other, taking rifles and carbines up and shooting at each other. And this continues today with the term Winchester, which means out of ammo, because it referred to them actually firing Winchesters at each other. Eventually, the aircraft themselves were equipped with machine guns, and the Germans were ahead of the game in this respect. Schneider and other inventors came up with what was called the synchronization or the interrupter gear. And this allowed a machine gun to be mounted on the engine nacelle and to fire through the propeller. And this was done by synchronizing the propeller with the actual firing mechanism of the machine gun. So it was very complicated linkage, because the propeller could be turning slowly or quickly depending on the engine settings. So it was revolutionary, and there were a couple of different systems. One was based on a camshaft and another was based on hydraulics. And it was only later in the war, when we captured the German model, that we were able to copy it. And for this reason, the Germans were very reluctant to venture over British lines with synchronized machine gun equipped aircraft, for fear of giving up the secrets. They were used to defend or to fight over their own territory mainly. So that allowed the Germans to have a centerline firing machine gun, which made aiming very, very easy. What we had to do was either put the guns out on the wing so they could clear the propeller, or equip the observer behind with a ring-mounted machine gun, or because sometimes you did both, have the machine gun mounted on the upper wing of a biplane. Most of these aircraft were biplanes or triplanes. So there'd be a wing over the pilot, and there'd be either a Lewis or a Vickers gun there. Now, these guns, they weren't designed for aircraft use, flying in freezing cold weather, in the rain and so on. And the stoppages were very, very frequent. Also, they had to change the drums which carried the ammo. So this was down to the pilot in the case of the ones mounted above him. And there's a story of a chap called Louis Strange, who features prominently in the book. He was also an instructor at some stage. His Lewis gun has suffered a stoppage, and he's trying to remove the drum while holding the control column, the stick, between his knees. He's standing up in the cockpit. Remember, all these aircraft were open cockpits. There were no canopies, and quite often they didn't wear seat belts. Also, they didn't have parachutes. And so he's standing there. He's trying to control the aircraft with his knees as he removes the drum, and the aircraft turns and he's upside down. He's hanging by the drum. Now, he was cursing this drum for not coming loose. Now he's hoping and praying that it will stay, and it actually does support his weight. And he's kind of working out, it's cutting through his fingers, the steel edges of the drum. So he works out where the strut would be, and he manages to grab it behind him and then flip his legs backwards and drop into the cockpit. And then he grabs the control column to right the aircraft, and unfortunately he's crushed the seat right through into the control wire, so he has to clear all that first before he can regain control. And when he lands, he's really rather nonchalant about this. There's other stories in the book, one where the observer seated behind the pilot, and the pilot's shot and he's dead. So the observer climbs out onto the wing, edges forward to the cockpit, and holding on with one hand holds the stick and manages to land the aircraft. Another story is that an observer climbs out, sits facing the tail astride the fuselage, which is on fire, and beats the flames out with his hands, and then climbs back in. I mean, some absolutely amazing stories. We are all familiar with the term aces, pilots, fighter pilots who have shot down a certain number of the enemy. This was a term devised by French newspapers, and it was quickly taken up. It caught the popular opinion, and soon all the relevant air forces were awarding the title of ace, at first informally and then more formally to pilots who scored usually 5, maybe 6 victories. There's a lot of talk, and it went on into World War II as well, about actually verifying shot down aircraft, because quite often you couldn't follow them down and so on. But many of the figures were actually on the modest side, that some of the guys had shot down more aircraft than they were credited for, one reason or another. Decorations, some of them got the Victoria Cross and so on. The Germans had their highest medal was known as the Blue Max. It was a Prussian award, and there was a movie made of that name. And the guys who were holders of the Blue Max were heroes. But sometimes it didn't count for much, and there's a story of one of the Blue Max winners, and he's on leave in Hamburg, and there's communist riots as a result of the war and the deprivations and so on. Communism was on its rise in Germany, particularly after the Bolshevik Revolution, and he's caught by a mob, and they strangle him with the ribbon of his Blue Max. Very sad story. Another activity was attacking the enemy observation balloons. These were exactly the same as the barrage balloons of World War II, the big elephant-like balloons filled with hydrogen, which were tethered at a certain height. The observer was in a wicker basket. Wicker must have been a tremendous industry during World War I. He did have a parachute, and he would be using binoculars and so on and observing, and he'd have a telephone wire down to the ground to direct artillery. And so they were quite a decent target for scout aircraft, which was the name for fighters back then. Problems where they were heavily defended by anti-aircraft, and also the ammunition was not really designed to ignite. The ball ammo obviously would just make a hole. Tracer wouldn't usually ignite the hydrogen, but incendiary ammo would. However, by the time you got close enough to set the balloon on fire, quite often you were flying through the actual burning mass of hydrogen yourself, and it was a hair-raising activity. The other thing, which I'd never ever heard of until now, is that the Germans would get balloons that were on the last legs that had been patched to death. They'd put them up, they'd put a dummy hanging over the basket as though he was the observer, but it would have lots of high explosive aboard, and it could be detonated from the ground. So as soon as the attacking aircraft got close enough, it could be taken out by the exploding balloon. Okay, there's an interesting chapter on aviation medicine. The rudimentary days, they didn't understand things like hypoxia. They started studying the effects of the cold. Remember, the guys are flying in open cockpits in the winter. They at first didn't have very suitable clothing, although there was a design called a Sidcot suit, which actually lingered on till World War II. It was an all-in-one, thickly insulated coat, so it did the job. But still, your extremities, your hands and your face and so on, they didn't really understand the effects of G-forces. They didn't understand the effects of flight maneuvers, on the balance and so on, disorientation, because man was an animal that it's sort of, his senses developed just by having to work on his own two legs, and now he's flying at high speeds and in terrible attitudes. So that was a very interesting. Also, a big chapter, or interesting chapter, on air defence, the defence of the UK, which is virtually non-existent at this time, against Zeppelin attack. Now, the Zeppelin were the huge airships which had engines. They flew higher than any of the fighter aircraft could, and they bombed targets, including London. They weren't devastating, but they had big effects on morale, and the commanders in Flanders and in the war were reluctant to release the squadrons for home defence, but eventually it was from Prime Minister level they had to, and they started trying to work out how to defeat the Zeppelins. It was very, very difficult. They had anti-aircraft and so on, but it was a problem that was never really solved. Then they used large bombers, the Goethe bomber and so on, and this was the start of what later became strategic bombing. I mentioned that there were no parachutes. The Germans did introduce parachutes in the last year of the war for many reasons, and it's really interesting to read why they didn't have parachutes. And it's a bit similar, in my mind, to the attitude towards Kevlar body armour in the early 70s in the United States law enforcement, that a lot of people poo-pooed the idea. A lot of people said it would kill you. You'd be killed by the blunt trauma. Well, no. You should be able to work the streets without needing body armour and so on, until a couple of guys lives were saved and word started spreading. And now it's completely the opposite. Any officer who attempted to go on patrol in the United States without soft body armour will be taken to one side and told his fortune. Another thing I never ever knew about the World War One aviation was that they used aircraft to insert agents, spies, into enemy territory, exactly the same as done by the special duty squadrons in the Second World War. And the aircraft actually much the same. You know, the Lysander aircraft, there was a big, slow design which could land in rough fields, which very similar to what they were using in the First World War. I found that absolutely fascinating. So James Hamilton Paterson, while discussing the technicalities of flight, weapons, the engine power, the strategies and so on, throughout he reminds us of the terrible human cost paid by young pilots of only 19, 20 years of age in many cases, who suffered terribly as they died on fire, burning as the aircraft plunged to the ground. And he does demonstrate compassion throughout for the pilots and also for the other casualties of the war, the terrible slaughter of World War One and the terrible conditions in which the men had to fight. Terrific book. I really enjoyed his previous book. He's a really excellent writer, tells the story well. And as I said, there's a lot in this that I've been reading aviation literature since I was at school. And there's a lot in this I hadn't known. And he brings it to the forefront in a most interesting way.